So today we're going to be looking at a section out of the book of Colossians. The book of Colossians, I think, in a lot of ways, was written for people that were kind of questioning, is continuing to follow Jesus worth it? They were people who I suspect got really excited about kind of that first love when they first met God, discovered God's invitation to this good news that he was involved in the world, that he was saving their lives, offering them new patterns of life. But over time, some of that thrill had gone away, especially as they're starting to get a harder and harder time from their neighbors, from the society overall, and so they're asking themselves, is this worth it? Is it worth continuing this journey of following God? And I think the other question they're asking themselves at times is, why is God so subtle? Why is God so patient? Why isn't God more obvious in the world? I think those are questions that I've struggled with many times over. I just wish God would be a little more obvious, wish God would move a little quicker sometimes, right? And so Paul in this section is kind of arguing that no, God is in fact enough, and the way he does things works. It's just often at a very different pace than we like to use. So I'm in Colossians chapter 3. One of the other kind of important things for this section I'm about to read, one of the kind of controlling metaphors to this whole thing, has to do with hiddenness. There's kind of some puns going on in there. This section is in many Bibles called our hidden life in Christ. The first kind of pun that he is playing on is one of the big temptations for a lot of the early church, including probably the Colossians, was this group of esoteric teachings that we kind of collectively call Gnosticism. And that word Gnostic means hidden or secret. And the way that this worked is still how many groups work. In that to really get at the good stuff, there was this hidden secret knowledge that you could be initiated into very slowly and secretly. Probably if you paid enough of your dues, you could get in on the really good secrets. It worked a little bit like a pyramid scheme. If you brought more people in, they'd let you move up the ladder. And this was a really tempting offer in a lot of ways. It felt like you were making progress. It felt like, you were one of the chosen, one of the special ones, versus, Jesus invites everybody. That can be boring at times. The best and the worst. There's an elitism in there that feels good. But the core of their name comes from this idea of hidden knowledge, of knowledge that was special and secret and hidden for them, which again is very different than the kind of public knowledge that is always available in Christianity. Another pun that's being played in on that hidden was in the ancient Near East, a very common euphemism for death was being hidden in the ground. And this image is definitely being played on here. This way of talking about being hidden in the ground, of being dead, is one that was used heavily in baptism. So the way baptism tended to work at this time, and the metaphor that Paul is going to build this on, was baptism was considered a very kind of a special sacred event. They were not doing revivals. They were not baptizing people on the spot very often, though we do see that most of the time, if people were considering joining the Christian church, this new family, this fellowship, they would actually start them with what we now call catechism. They would start them walking them through kind of the basic skills, the basic knowledge they had to do, so they could make a very kind of sober judgment saying, yes, I am in, even though I know this may cost me some things. This may cost me my family. This may cost me prestige in society. Within a few years, this may cost me my life, right? They wanted people to very soberly make that decision. So they thought about it for a while. And if they decided they were going to be in, usually baptism always happened on Easter Day. So, if you missed it by a month or something, you would wait 11 months. You'd be catechese, or whatever the word was, that entire time. And then what they would do is they would go into homes. They would go down into either cisterns or find underwater streams or springs. Usually it was indoors at this point because they were hiding it. The men and the women would separate because the tradition was you would in fact be baptized naked. You would take off the clothes you were wearing. You would go down into this water. You wouldn't usually just get rinsed. Most of the time, you would put your entire body under the water, representing death, representing being hidden in the earth with Christ. And then the thought was, as you came up again out of the water, you are in fact a new person. And so they had these special handmade robes, these white robes that they would give you, and you would put on this new set of clothes to show you are a new person. You've come back to life. Your identity has changed. It's a very beautiful kind of cultural expression around baptism. It's not how we do it anymore, but that imagery, those descriptions, just kind of haunt this passage that I'm about to read. So I'm in Colossians chapter 3, and I think that description of baptism you'll hear a lot in here, especially with this image of putting off your old clothes, right? Going down naked and dead and coming back into life to put on a brand new clothes, which represents a brand new identity. Okay, Colossians 3. Therefore, if you were raised with Christ, look for the things that are above where Christ is sitting at God's right side. Think about the things above and not the things on earth. You died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, is revealed, then you will also be revealed with him in glory. So put to death the parts of your life that belong to the earth, such as sexual immorality, moral corruption, lust, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. The wrath of God is coming upon disobedient people because of these things. You used to live this way when you were alive to those things, but now set aside such things as anger and rage, malice, slander, and obscene language. Don't lie to one another. Take off that old human nature with its practices and put on the new nature, which is renewed in knowledge by conforming to the image of the one who created it. In this image there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all things and in all people. Therefore, as God's choice, holy and loved, put on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Be tolerant with each other, and if someone has a complaint against anyone, forgive each other. As the Lord forgave you, so also forgive one another. And over all these things put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. The peace of Christ must control your hearts, a peace into which you are called in one body, and be thankful people. So you can hear a few times through there that image coming up again and again of putting off the old clothes, the old way of being in the world, the old ways of thinking, and put on something new, put on this new identity to be with Christ. In this first section, we hear it again and again. You know, you were raised with Christ. Look for the things that are above, where Christ is sitting at God's right side. And it's sometimes the way this passage and passages like it get interpreted is that there's spiritual things and that there are sacred things that are below, that are earthly, that are below. And he's using that imagery, but he's not meaning it in the sense that like normal life, that physicality, you know, the fact I'm a physical being is bad. In fact, in the Bible, it's really difficult to separate out what we often think of as like spiritual or ghostly and the physical. Those things are very intertwined in the biblical mind. And so I think what he's trying to argue here is the aim of our heart. Is it aimed at our old way of being? Is it about the sorts of things we used to be about? Things like selfishness, things like these other lists he's going to give us, right? Or is it aimed at God and God's way of being in the world, God's description of reality, God's description of what is actually important, God's evaluation of who is important? Hint, everybody, compared to the way we often rank and size people up, that, you know, often hiddenness and patience and self-sacrifice are actually more important than the world's ways of power and prestige and glory, money, right? The things that are obvious and look like they're important don't always measure up in God's mind. And so this section talking about putting on these things are above, the way our life actually works, I think has a lot to do with what is our heart aimed at? What are we looking at? What are we trying to conform our lives to? Is it heavenly things, Christly things? Does it match his way of being in the world? Or are we, in fact, looking at what amounts to hell? Are we, in fact, inviting and living hellish things on the world, things that do not bring life, things that are self-focused rather than other-focused, etc., right? Putting on this new self means there's a new definition for so many things. And so the question, of course, always for us as people who are trying to aim our hearts toward Christ and his things is, do we know Jesus? Do we know God? Do we not know just about God, but do we know the sorts of people he spent time with and the ways he used his resources and the ways he valued people, the things that he thought were important, his outlook on life? We can all grow in those things, definitely. But it can be easy to know more about God and saying abstract things about God than it can to be to know God and know God's ways at times. And so this next section kind of again gives us this contrast and continues the discussion. We've got these kind of listy sounding things. So put to death the parts of your life that belong to the earth, right, that are aimed towards the old life, such as sexual immorality, moral corruption, lust, evil desire, greed, which is idolatry. Those This list, I think, are examples. It's not like a permanent full list of all these things that are bad, right? Which, again, sadly is how it's sometimes approached. But these are examples of this earth-facing, this old life-facing, this hell-facing heart. And it's interesting in kind of the original language, these all actually would have had pretty strong sexual connotations, which don't always come across in English. But the image there is he says, don't do these things, lusting, looking after other evil desires, greed for others, because these things are idolatry, he says. Idolatry, of course, is trying to make something into God that is not God. And it's interesting that he uses words for idolatry, which all have this sexual connotation. And I think that's playing on this Old Testament idea that comes up again and again, that idolatry, worshiping or having our life be based around anything besides God, in God's mind is the same as adultery. He feels cheated. Someone who loved him and was meant for him is giving away their love and their body. And so there are lots of sections in the Old Testament that use idolatry and adultery somewhat interchangeably. That's how it feels to God, and I think he's probably playing on that here. We get another list, a few more down in verse 8. This one's things like anger, rage, malice, slander, obscene language. Again, I think these are examples of kind of a old way of focus, an old way of being, that old set of clothing. These ones all have to do with, I think, disdain and violence towards other people. So if the great commandments in the Bible are love God and love people, we see both examples, right? Saying love God, focus your attention on him, don't cheat on him in idolatry. And in people, don't see people as in your way, don't see people as something to get something out of. Love them, which is going to come up again. So our relationships in both ways need to be really different than they often are. And the reason we can take off those old practices, those old things, and put on this new nature, which is renewed in knowing and conforming to the image of the one who created it. And this section of the image, this new identity we're given, I think is a really important one, of who are we modeling ourselves after? How do we get past, some of these adulterous ideas? How do we get past seeing people as in our way, as objects that we need to fight? Well, we do it by thinking, by knowing, by imitating the master, the image, the one who shows us how this all works. I was thinking this idea of an image reminded me of the printmaking I do. One of my kind of side gigs, one of my hobbies is I'm a artistic printmaker, and this image is an awful lot like this is a linoleum plate mounted on a piece of wood, but what I do is I carve these, and then if I can carve the image I want in here, I put ink on it, and then I can put a piece of paper on it and smash it all down, and then I get an image afterwards that is going to imitate it just, depending on how well of a job I did. So you can see this is the image that came from that plate. You can see there's a lot of different things you can do it. Here's another taken from that same one. Here's another one. You'll note that these are different colors. You'll note that there are some flaws. You can see spots that the ink didn't go well. I could even show you examples of ones that as I put the paper on it, I smeared it like this. You can imagine how much that looked like the original image, right? In printmaking, usually the way you show skill, what's considered a good print, is if it looks as close as possible to the original plate, the original image. And I think that is the image I have for what we are trying to do as we put off the old way of being in the world and put on this new one. Our goal is to look at and see the plate, the image of who Christ is and how he was in the world. And we are trying to imitate that, make our lives look as much as is like possible. And like the print, you notice the different colors I could use, the different backgrounds, the mix of those things. That I think allows for an incredible amount of diversity within the human race, and that's the way it's supposed to be. But the basic contours, the basic people we are meant to be, will look really different in the world as we're part of different races, as we're part of different cultures, as we're different ages, different stages in life, etc. But the basic print, the basic shape of our lives is still going to look like Christ. That is the image we see again and again. And so we're given kind of a practical look at what this could be at the very end of this section. He says, therefore, as God's choice, holy and loved, put on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Be tolerant of each other, and if someone has a complaint against anyone, forgive each other. As the Lord forgave you, so also forgive one another. So I think, again, we had examples of kind of a hellishly aimed heart before, right? In the idolatry and the violence towards others. Here we have an example of a more Godward trained heart, a heart that is aimed at Jesus and his ways of being in the world, that image of that plate that we are trying to take our image from. And I think it's interesting that very last one he says, as the Lord forgave you, so forgive one another. I think you can say this for this entire example list, right? We can put on compassion because God has had compassion on us. We can be kind because we've had someone be kind to us. We can have humility because someone showed us what humility actually is, gentleness, patience, being tolerant with people as well, right? All those things are God-ish things because we have in fact received those and experienced them from God in the first place. And like all blessings, the hope is that we will then extend that to others. And so God is not asking us to just try really hard. He's asking us to share and pass on something that we have already experienced. Over all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. Unity. Unity is something I think our world and our culture can desperately need, and that can only come from love. I think in love, we can show a unity and an understanding of people who are really different from us or who we don't always agree with, right? Because we love them, we can agree to disagree. And in our world, there's a lot lacking in our love right now, and so we do struggle with just the deep fissures in our lives, in our society, even with our coworkers and neighbors, right? Because we don't love first. Unity is very difficult. Again, one of the major aspects of that print on our lives needs to be love and unity with those around us. I really liked this next phrase as well. The peace of Christ must control your hearts, a peace into which you were called in one body. How different of a world would we live in if more people, if more Christians' lives were controlled by peace, not by fear? How much fear, how much anxiety is there in your life, in our churches, in our friends and our neighbors, right? People are afraid things aren't going to work out. There are so many things we're aware of that can go wrong and often do go wrong, right? And yet, if Jesus was able to trust that things will all be about walking toward the cross, knowing he's going to be murdered and he's going to have to take on all of humanity's sin, he trusted that God knew what was on the other side of that. What if we had that same peace? What if that was a piece of that ink plate we pulled up? A just trust and a sense of peace that things are going to be all right. And in a similar way, it says, and be thankful people. Thankful people are people who don't always look at what they lack or what they want or that next thing or that next hurdle to jump. They are people who look at what they have, what they've been given, what they've been blessed with, both in the material resources realm, in the spiritual realm of what things God has done, and we've experienced that list we were just hearing about, right? We are people, if we're thankful, who see what we have received and recognize that it is good and it is enough. Again, how different would the world look if Christians were known as people who were satisfied and who had enough and who could even give away because they weren't afraid there wasn't going to be enough for them. We don't need to fight for our ways. We don't need to fight or worry about the next thing that is coming or always be looking at what we want and what we lack. I'm just struck in this passage, again, if we have in fact taken away this old way of being, if we are in the process of imitating our image, our ink plate of Christ, if the meaning of our lives is actually hidden in Him, how differently would we go about in the world, right? And it reminds me to come back to our kind of initial question, right? Doesn't it feel like God is often too patient? God is not obvious enough. And I look at this list, I look at the things in here, and that is, I guess, still my problem with it. A lot of this stuff is yet to be revealed. A lot of the selflessness I see here, a lot of the patience, the willingness to forgive, the love and unity, these are things that are easy to miss. And yet they are things, this hidden life of ours that we have in Christ is something that will be revealed. It is something that I think is revealed in small ways when we're willing to look. And so maybe I leave us with the question, are you willing to look for this hidden life in the lives of each other, your brothers and sisters? Are you willing to live this hidden life in Christ, in God, even if no one else notices? If God is the only one who notices, is that enough for us? Because, again, Paul is inviting us to a good life, a good hidden life in God, which will be revealed in full, which we won't be aware of until it's at the end. But I think, again, drawing our lives from Jesus' plate, Jesus' image, we have a very different way of being in the world.